Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever realized your value at work only after it was almost too late? Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about business, power, and real-life consequences, don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Laura Bennett, and for years, I worked in a role most people didn't fully understand, but constantly depended on. I wasn't the face of the company, and I wasn't the loudest voice in the room. I was the one who reviewed risk, cleared compliance, and gave the final approval before major decisions moved forward. When something big needed to be signed off, it usually came across my desk last. At the time, the company was pushing hard to close a $120 million expansion deal before the end of the quarter. It was the biggest project we'd attempted in years, and leadership wanted it done fast. I was responsible for the final compliance clearance. Without it, the deal couldn't move. That morning, I was deep in the last set of documents, double-checking details others had already stopped caring about. Then a calendar notification appeared. A meeting request from HR, marked urgent. No explanation. Just a time and a room number. I arrived at the HR office a few minutes early, still holding my notebook from the compliance review. The hallway felt strangely quiet for the middle of a workday. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the atmosphere was off. My manager was already seated, along with an HR representative I barely knew. No one smiled. No one made small talk. They just asked me to sit. The HR representative began speaking in a calm, rehearsed tone, explaining that due to restructuring, my role was being eliminated effective immediately. The words felt distant, like they were meant for someone else. I waited for a transition plan, a discussion about ongoing projects, especially the $120 million deal sitting on my desk. Nothing came. Instead, they slid a packet across the table and asked for my badge. My laptop access had already been disabled. I remember asking one question quietly. What about the projects I'm responsible for? My manager avoided eye contact and said the team would handle everything. That answer stayed with me. Not because it reassured me, but because it didn't make sense. As I walked out carrying a small box of personal items, one thought kept repeating in my mind. They had no idea what they had just interrupted. The first few hours at home felt unreal. I set my things down on the kitchen table and just sat there, trying to process what had happened. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, every word, every expression, every moment where I expected someone to mention a transition plan. But there was nothing. No questions about open approvals. No requests for handovers. That's when something began to bother me. I had been in the final stage of reviewing the compliance clearance for the $120 million expansion. My name was attached to the last certification. It wasn't something that could simply be reassigned with a click. It required direct authorization, documentation, and accountability. I opened my phone and checked my email out of habit, only to remember my access was gone. That uneasy feeling started to grow. If they cut me off that quickly, no one had walked through the final approval process with me. No one had taken responsibility for it. An hour later, my phone rang. It was a junior colleague from my team. Her voice sounded uncertain as she asked if I had a minute to explain where the final authorization checklist was saved. I paused, realizing something she didn't yet understand. There was no checklist. I took a slow breath before answering her. I could hear the tension in her voice, like she was trying not to sound worried. She repeated the question, asking where the final approval checklist was stored so they could move the deal forward. I told her gently that there wasn't a checklist. The last stage required direct certification, risk confirmation, and a formal sign-off tied to my credentials. There was silence on the other end. Not confusion. Silence. She asked if someone else could access the same process. I explained that it wasn't just a file or a template. The system recorded the responsible authority, and until that changed officially, nothing could be completed. I could almost feel the realization hitting her in real time. She thanked me quickly and hung up. For the next hour, I sat there staring at my phone, replaying the conversation. It wasn't what she asked that unsettled me. It was how unprepared she sounded. No one had briefed her. No one had explained the process. They had simply assumed they could pick up where I left off. Late that afternoon, Another call came through. This time, it wasn't someone junior. It was a senior manager from the project team. And his tone was far less calm. The senior manager didn't waste time on small talk. He asked me directly where the final compliance clearance was located and how long it would take for someone else to complete it. I explained, as clearly as I could, that the clearance wasn't a document waiting to be found. It was a certification process that required the assigned authority to review, confirm, and sign off. He paused, then asked if I had already completed it before leaving. I told him no. I had been in the middle of final verification when I was called into HR. That answer changed the entire tone of the conversation. His voice grew tighter, more focused. He asked if there was a way for someone to step in and finish it quickly. I told him the authority would have to be reassigned formally, reviewed by legal, and updated in the system before anyone could take responsibility. Another silence. This time, it felt heavier. Before ending the call, he said they were on a tight timeline and needed to close the deal soon. I told him I understood, but the process couldn't be rushed without risk. After we hung up, I finally understood what was happening. The deal wasn't just delayed. It was completely frozen. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time, it was an executive I rarely spoke to directly. He sounded unusually friendly, asking how I was doing and saying he hoped I was settling in after the sudden change. The conversation felt careful, like he was choosing every word. Then he got to the point. He asked if I could spare a few minutes to walk someone through the final approval steps. Just a quick call, he said. Something simple to help the team move things along. I could hear the urgency beneath the polite tone. I explained, calmly, that the process wasn't something I could just explain in a few minutes. It required assigned authority, documentation reviews, and formal accountability. There wasn't a shortcut. He hesitated before asking the question directly. So we can't close without you? For a moment, I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because I was realizing the truth myself as I said it out loud. No, I replied. Not the way the system is set up. There was a long pause on the line. When he finally spoke again, the friendliness was gone. And for the first time, I heard something I hadn't expected. Concern. After that call, the silence that followed felt different. No one reached out for the rest of the day. No emails, no messages, nothing. It gave me time to think, and the more I thought, the more certain memories started pushing their way back to the surface. For months leading up to the deal's final stage, I had been slowing things down. Not on purpose, but because there were gaps that needed to be addressed. Missing confirmations. Incomplete documentation. Timelines that felt too aggressive for something this big. Every time I raised a concern, leadership pushed back, reminding me how important it was to close before the quarter ended. I remembered one meeting in particular where I had refused to clear a section without additional verification. The room had gone quiet. One executive had leaned back in his chair, clearly irritated, and asked how much longer I needed. At the time explained I was protecting the company. Now, sitting alone at home, I started to see it from a different angle. I hadn't just been protecting the company. I had been slowing them down. And in a project where speed meant everything, I was starting to look less like a safeguard and more like a problem. That thought settled heavily in my mind. Later that evening, a former coworker I trusted sent me a short message asking if I was okay. We spoke briefly, and her voice was low, careful, like she didn't want to be overheard even through the phone. She told me the office had been tense since I left. Meetings were happening back to back, and no one seemed to have clear answers. I asked if they had reassigned the final compliance authority yet. She said they were trying. Apparently, legal was involved now, reviewing how to transfer responsibility properly. The problem was no one had expected to do it so quickly. They thought the process would be simple. It wasn't. She also mentioned something else that made my stomach tighten. Investors were already asking for confirmation that the deal was on schedule. Leadership had been assuring them everything was under control. But internally, nothing was moving. When I asked how serious it looked, she hesitated before answering. They're saying if this gets delayed much longer, it could affect funding. After we ended the call, I sat there quietly, letting that sink in. This wasn't just an internal inconvenience anymore. This was starting to affect real money. The next call came from someone in the legal department. That alone told me how serious things had become. He introduced himself politely and asked if I had a few minutes to clarify a couple of process questions related to the final approval stage. His tone was calm, but very direct. He wanted to know if I had ever pre-approved any part of the compliance clearance before my termination. I told him I hadn't. The review was still in progress. Nothing had been finalized. He asked if there were any temporary authorizations in place that could allow the deal to proceed while they reassigned responsibility. Again, I told him no. The final certification required one accountable authority at the point of approval. There was no overlap system. He thanked me and ended the call quickly. The conversation was brief, but the message behind it was clear. They were searching for a way around the process, hoping I had unknowingly left something behind that could help them move forward. I hadn't. And for the first time since I left that office, I felt the full weight of what that meant. They weren't just delayed. They were stuck, and they didn't know how to fix it. 2 days passed without any direct calls, but the silence didn't mean things had settled. It felt more like something was building behind the scenes. Late that afternoon, my trusted coworker reached out again. Her voice was more tense this time. She told me they had tried assigning the approval authority to another senior manager, thinking it would solve the problem quickly. It didn't. The system still showed my name as the final responsible party. Legal had flagged it immediately. Until the authority was formally transferred and verified, no one else could step in without creating serious accountability risks. The reassignment process itself was taking longer than expected because of the deal's size and exposure. I listened quietly as she explained how frustrated leadership had become. Meetings were getting louder. Timelines were slipping. Everyone thought replacing me would be simple, but the structure I had maintained was far more embedded than they realized. Before we ended the call, she said something that stuck with me. They thought this would take a day. It's already been 3. That was the moment it truly hit me. This wasn't just a delay anymore. My absence wasn't slowing the deal down. It was holding the entire thing in place. The next morning, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, the voice introduced himself as a representative from one of the external partner firms involved in the expansion. His tone was polite but concerned. He explained that communication from the company had suddenly become unclear. Approvals that were expected by the end of the week hadn't come through, and no one was giving a straight answer about why. He asked if I was still overseeing the final compliance stage. I hesitated before telling him I was no longer with the company. There was a pause on the line. Not just surprise, but uncertainty. He asked who had taken over the role. I told him I didn't know. I hadn't been part of any transition. He thanked me for the information and ended the call quickly. The moment I set my phone down, a heavy realization settled in. This wasn't contained inside the company anymore. External partners were starting to notice the delay. And once outside parties began seeing confusion, questions would turn into pressure. Real pressure. That call stirred a memory I hadn't thought about in weeks. A leadership meeting from not long before my termination. I could still picture the conference room clearly. The tension. The urgency. The way everyone kept repeating how critical the timeline was. During that meeting, I had pushed back on approving one section of the deal. There were still unresolved compliance concerns, and I wasn't comfortable signing off without proper documentation. I explained the risks carefully, but the reaction in the room had shifted. One executive in particular had leaned forward, clearly frustrated. He asked how much longer I planned to hold things up. I told him I wasn't holding anything up. I was making sure we weren't exposed later. The room had gone quiet after that. At the time, I thought it was just pressure. Now, looking back, it felt different. Like I had crossed an invisible line by refusing to move faster. As the memory faded, another thought followed closely behind. I had been removed right before the final approval stage, and I was the one person who kept insisting on slowing things down. Later that evening, I received a message from a senior manager I used to work closely with. It was short and careful, asking if I had time to talk privately. When we spoke, his voice was low, almost guarded. He told me the atmosphere inside the office had changed completely since I left. According to him, meetings were happening constantly and no one seemed to have a clear plan. Different departments were trying to figure out the final approval steps on their own, and every attempt kept leading back to the same problem. My name was still attached to the last stage, and no one wanted to admit they didn't know how to replace it quickly. He said something else that caught my attention. Leadership was starting to get nervous, but no one wanted to acknowledge the real reason for the delay. Instead, they were blaming technical issues, system backlogs, anything that sounded temporary. I asked him if anyone had explained to the team why I was removed so suddenly. He hesitated. Then he said, "No one's talking about that part." When the call ended, that silence felt louder than anything he had said. Because if no one wanted to explain my exit, it meant there was more to it than I had been told. The next afternoon, I received an email from the company's main HR contact. The tone was formal but noticeably softer than before. They asked if I would be open to returning temporarily as an external consultant to help guide the final compliance process for the expansion deal. Reading those words, I felt a strange mix of validation and caution. Just days earlier, my role had been described as unnecessary. Now they were asking me to come back and help finish the most critical stage. The message mentioned urgency, tight deadlines, and the importance of ensuring everything was completed properly. There was no apology, but the shift in tone said enough. They needed help, and they knew it. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat there rereading the email, noticing what it didn't say. There was no mention of what went wrong, no explanation for why I had been removed in the first place. Just a request to step back in. For the first time, I realized I had leverage. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if helping them immediately was the right decision. That night, my phone buzzed again. It was my former coworker, her voice tight with worry. She told me the delay was starting to cost the company money. The project had missed one of its internal funding checkpoints, and now there were discussions about possible penalties if the timeline slipped further. I sat quietly as she explained how tense things had become. Leadership was under pressure to keep the deal on track, and every day without final approval was making the situation worse. What shocked me most was how fragile the whole structure sounded. This deal wasn't just important. It was time-sensitive in a way no one had fully explained before. When I asked how serious it was, she paused before answering. "They built everything around this closing on time," she said. "If it doesn't, a lot of things get affected." After we ended the call, I stared at the wall for a long time. All those months I had spent slowing things down, asking for more documentation, pushing for proper reviews. I thought I was being cautious. Now I was starting to wonder if I had been standing in the way of something far bigger than I realized. The next morning, I met an old colleague for coffee. We kept it casual at first, talking about anything except work, but eventually the conversation drifted back to the company. She glanced around before leaning in slightly, lowering her voice. "I heard something you should probably know," she said. According to her, HR hadn't made the decision to remove me on their own. The instruction had come from higher up. Senior leadership had pushed for immediate action, and HR had simply carried it out. There hadn't been a long evaluation or restructuring plan. It had been quick and direct. That information sat heavily with me. I asked if anyone knew why. She shook her head. No one was being told anything. People were just following orders and trying to keep the deal moving. As we finished our coffee, I kept thinking about the timing. I hadn't been let go during a quiet period or after a project ended. I had been removed right in the middle of the most critical phase. And it wasn't HR's idea. Which meant someone with real authority had decided I needed to go. I walked back to my car with one question growing louder in my mind. Who had decided I was a problem? That question stayed with me the entire day. I sat at home, going through old notes and reminders on my phone, replaying conversations from the past few months. The more I thought about it, the more one pattern became impossible to ignore. I had been the person slowing the deal down. Every time leadership wanted to move faster, I was the one asking for more documentation. When deadlines were pushed forward, I was the one insisting we confirm every requirement. I never thought of it as resistance. I thought of it as responsibility. But from the other side, it might have looked very different. It might have looked like I was standing in the way of progress. That thought made something click into place. If someone believed I was delaying the deal, removing me would clear that obstacle instantly. No more questions. No more hesitation. Just a clear path to closing. Except that wasn't what happened. Instead, everything slowed down even more. Which meant whoever made that decision didn't fully understand what my role actually controlled. And that raised a more troubling possibility. They didn't just want the deal to move faster. They wanted it to move without me. Later that evening, I opened my personal email and began scrolling through old messages I had saved over time. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first, just trying to reconnect the pieces. But as I read through past conversations, one name started appearing again and again. One executive had been especially persistent in pushing the timeline forward. He had sent frequent reminders about deadlines, questioned why certain checks were necessary, and often asked if parts of the process could be handled after closing. At the time, I had pushed back politely but firmly. Compliance didn't work that way. Now, reading those messages again, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The tone had shifted over time. Early emails were professional. Later ones were sharper, more impatient. And in one message, sent just a week before my termination, he had written, "We can't afford more delays at this stage." I stared at that line for a long time. It wasn't proof of anything on its own. But it was enough to make me wonder if he had been the one pushing for speed at any cost. And if he had seen me as the reason things kept slowing down. The following morning, another email arrived from the company. This one wasn't from HR. It came directly from a senior operations executive. The message was brief, professional, and noticeably more urgent than before. They were offering a short-term consulting agreement, this time with a much higher rate than what had been mentioned earlier. The difference in tone was impossible to ignore. They weren't casually asking for help anymore. They were trying to secure it. The email emphasized how critical my experience was to completing the final stage correctly. It mentioned tight deadlines, increasing pressure from partners, and the importance of minimizing further delays. Still, there was no explanation for why I had been removed so suddenly. Just an assumption that I would step back in and fix things. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop. It wasn't just the money that caught my attention. It was the urgency behind it. They were escalating and fast. For the first time, I realized they might be running out of options. And if they were offering this much already, it meant the situation inside was far more serious than they were willing to admit. Later that afternoon, I got another update from inside. My former coworker sounded exhausted. She told me meetings had become tense and chaotic. Departments were blaming each other for the delays, and leadership was under increasing pressure to explain why the deal hadn't closed yet. Apparently, the missed deadline had triggered more than just internal concern. Certain funding arrangements were tied to specific milestones, and those milestones were now slipping. Every day, without final approval, was making the situation worse. I listened quietly as she described how quickly the mood in the office had changed. What started as confidence had turned into frustration, then worry. Now it felt closer to panic. She told me something else that made everything feel heavier. No one expected it to get this serious this fast. After the call ended, I sat there trying to process it. For months, I had been treated like I was slowing things down. Now, with me gone, everything had stalled completely. The deal wasn't just delayed anymore. It was starting to look unstable. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was the executive whose emails I had been rereading. I recognized his voice immediately. But the tone was different from what I remembered. Slower. Careful. Almost cautious. He started by asking how I was doing, then moved quickly to the real reason for the call. He admitted they had underestimated how complex the final compliance stage really was. He said the team was struggling to move things forward without my involvement. Hearing that from him felt strange. He had been one of the strongest voices pushing for speed. Now he sounded like someone trying to repair a situation he didn't fully control anymore. He told me they were trying to sort out the authority transfer but were running into complications. Legal reviews, system updates, verification delays. Everything was taking longer than planned. Before ending the call, he said something that stayed with me. "We didn't realize how much was tied to you." I didn't respond right away, because as I listened to him speak, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something he wasn't saying. After that call, I couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had only scratched the surface. His tone had been careful, measured, like he was choosing exactly how much to say and nothing more. So the next time he reached out, I decided not to let it stay vague. I asked him directly why I had been removed right before the final stage of the biggest deal the company had in years. There was a pause on the line, longer than before. He eventually gave the same explanation I'd heard from HR: restructuring, changing priorities, a need to streamline operations. The words sounded polished, but they didn't answer the question. If anything, they made it feel more distant from the truth. I let the silence sit between us for a moment before ending the call. That night, I kept replaying everything again. The pressure to move faster, the sudden removal, the lack of transition. It all felt too precise to be random. Just as I was about to put my phone down, a message came through from the one coworker who had been quietly keeping me informed. It was short. "There's more to why they removed you. I can't say it over the phone." We met the next morning in a quiet corner of a cafe across town. She looked nervous, checking the door more than once before speaking. When she finally did, her voice was low and steady. She told me leadership had been frustrated with how often I slowed the process down. Not publicly, but behind closed doors. They believed the final approval stage was taking longer than it should. The delays were making investors impatient, and pressure was building from above. So a decision was made. They thought if I was removed, the process could move faster. Hearing that didn't shock me as much as I expected. In a way, it confirmed what I had already suspected. I had been seen as the obstacle, the person asking too many questions at the worst possible time. But then she added something that made my stomach tighten. They assumed someone else could just take over and push it through. That was the part that changed everything. They hadn't removed me because my role wasn't important. They removed me because they thought my caution was slowing down the deal. And they believed the approval could happen faster without me. On my drive home, her words kept replaying in my mind. If they believed removing me would speed things up, then they hadn't just misunderstood my role. They had misunderstood the entire approval structure. And maybe, more importantly, they had underestimated the risks I had been trying to point out. Later that afternoon, I opened my old notes again, reading through the compliance concerns I had flagged before everything happened. Missing confirmations, unverified numbers, details I had refused to clear without full documentation. At the time, I thought I was being thorough. Now I started to see it differently. If the deal had gone through without those checks, whoever signed off would have carried the responsibility if something went wrong later. And I was the one expected to sign. The realization settled slowly. By removing me, they hadn't just cleared a path. They had removed the person who kept refusing to approve something that didn't feel fully secure. And now, with the deadline closing in and pressure rising, they needed that same person back to make it official. In the days that followed, the messages became more direct, more urgent, and far more careful. The same people who once rushed me out without a second thought were now asking for meetings, offering revised consulting terms, and speaking with a level of respect I had never heard before. They needed the deal to close, and they needed it to be legitimate. I sat with everything I had learned, replaying the past few months in my mind. I had been removed because I asked questions, because I slowed things down, because I refused to sign off until every risk was accounted for. They believed the process would move faster without me. Instead, it had come to a complete stop. And now, the most unsettling part had become clear. They didn't just want me back to explain the process. They wanted me to be the one who signed the final approval. If anything went wrong later, that signature would carry the responsibility. The same caution they once saw as an obstacle was now the only thing protecting them. For the first time since I walked out of that office, I understood the position I was truly in. I wasn't the one asking for my job back. They were asking for my protection. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.